Ми продовжуємо роботу в українському.
We continue our work in Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Now we will have the round table discussion problems and prospects for the creation of oil reserves in Ukraine. I'm giving the floor to Mr. Gennady Ryabtsev, Director of Special Projects of the STC Psyche. Thank you for coming to everyone. The topic is very important because for some reason it is believed that the build-up of minimum stocks of crude oil and petroleum products in Ukraine is about 2022, 2023. Long-term perspective, but analyzing supply of petroleum products to Ukraine, we can calculate very easily that using Russian crude oil, petroleum products are produced and they are supplied to Ukraine in the amounts which are critical for the energy security of the state in any time. By political pressure on the Belarus, the Russian Federation is able to block significant amount of supply of petroleum products both from Russia and via Belarus or by transit from Lithuania. So creation of minimum stocks of crude oil and petroleum products should start as early as possible without waiting for the 31st of December 2022. Taking this into consideration, we invited rather representative community here, both domestic and foreign experts representing the projects promoting the implementation of Directive 119 in Ukraine on minimum reserves of crude oil and petroleum products in Ukraine. I would like to give the floor to the organizers of this conference, in particular the coordinator of DiXi Group, Tkachuk. I am giving the floor to him. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad that you are here. This roundtable discussion is organized thanks to the help of Renaissance Foundation and the European Union. The topic seems to be specialized and narrow, but we should understand that it is an integral part of the energy security of the country. We know that multiple attempts of pressure on our country via energy sector, via gas sector and liquefied petroleum gas means that the implementation of this directive is not only our obligation and requirement which we should meet to exceed the European Union. It is an important part of protecting our country from the energy attacks on it, which are direct component of the situation which we experience today. So we should make more secure situation via creation of oil reserves, and then we will become independent or less dependent on the drop or disruption of supply of oil or monopolic supplies of liquefied gas from Russia, and will provide us the opportunity to diversify deliveries and imports, and we should also try to increase our own oil production in domestic. Thank you to all the attendees for coming. Thank you, Taras. Now, I'm giving the floor. I'm very glad to give the floor to our colleague, Team Lead the Energy and Environment Support Group for Ukraine at the European Commission, Torsten Woellert.
I will say a few words in English, if you don't mind, because after all this time, my Ukrainian is still not really existing. Thank you very much for this invitation and for this very important event, because it is clearly in line with the discussions that we are currently having in different areas between Ukraine and the European Union, which is about how Ukraine in the future becomes a valuable member of the Energy Union, which is presented by Vice President Shevchevich. We have worked on oil stocks already for quite some time, and we're also very glad that we have experts with us at the round table who are directly working with the State Reserve and with the Ukrainian authorities to help setting this up best according to best practices. And it's also part of the wider energy security, in addition to what it means for Ukraine, but what it also means for Europe. Because energy security is shared, and we see this when we talk about gas reserves, we see this when we talk about winter preparedness, we also see this when we talk in the future about connecting our electricity grids. It is very difficult to think about energy security really only in a national framework. It has some repercussions. And that's why we're very glad that Ukraine is now making these important steps towards building a national oil reserve in line with best standards, IEA, Energy Community, Association Agreement of the EU, and also to work with experts who come directly from EU member states who have had similar experiences some years ago when they were building up their national reserves and when they were integrating their energy systems with the European Union systems. And this is something which I would always like to stress. Energy security is also based on trust. You trust in your own system, in your country, but you also trust that if really things go very badly, you can also get help from your neighbors. And this is also important, that you have transparency and that you have international cooperation, and also that in the end, the system that you set up is reliable and is also available, in the worst case, to help your neighbors. I think we will have a lot of discussion about the national aspect, but I wanted to stress this at the beginning. Thank you.
Дякую, Торстене.
Thank you, Mr. Torsten. That's always welcome words. We are now giving the floor to our speakers, and I'd like to start with introducing the speaker who is one of the drivers of the implementation of the mandatory obligations in Ukraine on build-up of crude oil and petroleum products reserves in Ukraine. The top officials, among them only State Reserve Agency representatives, in particular Mr. Vadym Mosiychuk, have been paying adequate attention to the implementation of this directive. Why it is so? I think this is because he will tell us why the situation is like this. Well, thank you. I do not see myself as a civil servant, but as a CEO who is working for the state. What you have already said and what Mr. Torsten Woellert said about the need to create such stocks, it is true, because everything now works just in time in Ukraine for us. Everything which is important to Ukraine, everything is used at once, and now we see the situations in some big corporations. It is the right time when we should not talk whether we need the stocks. We need strategic stocks. This is not in question. The question is how we can build them up. I share the ideas of Mr. Torsten Woellert that the trust is the main thing, and creation of these reserves is the direct way to European integration, which would approximate Ukraine to the European Union. Talking about specific issues, the State Reserve Agency, starting with 2015, have already separated this as a separate line, the build-up of oil stocks, and we started cooperated with the energy community very closely. Thank you to Mr. Adrian Jasimi, who will be also speaking today. The work was very fruitful, and in 2015-2016 we have announced some indicators, but also we accelerated the work when we started being supported by the team from the European Commission. The experts of the team very fruitfully, according to the action plan, developed the elements how to create these stocks. As of today, I can give details, I cannot give numbers, but I can tell you about the direction in which we are moving forward. The most acceptable scenario how to build up stocks is the best practice of Czechoslovakia. Slovakia has very powerful stock reserve system. At the same time, according to the directive, these stocks have been formed, and we believe this model is most applicable and adjustable for Ukrainian situation. In the framework of this model, we propose to establish an agency at the State Reserve Agency. It should be a non-profit organization, but an independent one. As a civil servant and as a citizen, I will be putting all my best efforts to make this institution an independent one, so that nobody can control it. In the framework of work of this expert, the State Reserve Agency has formed a work group. In this group, all stakeholders, all market players were invited, and all stakeholders had the opportunity to talk to our experts, and I see that the work group unanimously is moving in the same direction. This is very good for the final document to see consensus. As concerns the action plan, we plan by the end of this year to prepare the draft resolution of the cabinet approving the model. In November, it will be publicized for the public of Ukraine, but we should provide the model. We should move within the deadlines. One of the figures which was calculated by the experts, and it is the level of the stock. Having analyzed the statistics on 2015-2016, we have the figure of 90 days of net imports, which is 2,110,000 tons of crude oil equivalent. What questions we now face in the work group, which we should answer in the short time? Talking about having analyzed the practices of the European Union, all stocks should be payable by someone. In the work group, we found that the stock could be funded from creation of the new excise duty for formation of minimum reserves of crude oil and petroleum products. and the excise duty on petroleum and diesel should be cancelled. Whether we need it, whether we need the excise duty on the stocks, those significant reserves which the country needs, which are critical, whether they should be subject to excise duty. We have an excise duty today, but we think it might be cancelled, probably. The experts also have developed tariffs. They will be presented in November. The State Reserve Agency doesn't want to have everything. We would like to share the opportunities and responsibility among the state and the market players. So if we analyze the available storage capacities, we believe that 100% of stocks the State Reserve Agency cannot store, so partially they should be stored by market players. If we analyze the figures, in total, the existing storage tank capacity which we could use at the first stage of building up the reserves is over million of cubic meters, and we should modernize 622,000. We need more than 1 million cubic meter of capacity that should be repaired. The storage tank capacities could be created on the account of the State Reserve Agency, or we can promote the market to build such storage tank capacity. So it is possible to set investment tariffs which will provide market players with the opportunity to build new tanks for storage. The next key element to be created by the work group, whether we need to engage on mandatory basis market players to maintain these mandatory stocks in the EU countries, our neighbors. On the legislative basis, market players are obliged to maintain stocks for 20, 30 or 40 days. We should also ensure this opportunity in Ukraine, but we should also ask market players what they think. If obligation would be 20 days, then the 70 days load on the state will be far less than 100% load. One of the options is to fund from the national budget, from this, but the State Reserve Agency does not count on the budget. Slovakia demonstrated the best practice that country should not count only on the national budget in funding of the build-up of crude oil and petroleum product stock. We should engage commercial institutes, business institutions, maybe creation of some credit lines should be considered. Excise duty should be mathematically calculated. also to help us to form these reserves. Here are the questions which we face. In principle, the State Reserve Agency continues working actively under support of the energy community and the Cabinet of Ministers and the Prime Minister of Ukraine. I am sure these stocks would be built up and will start operating since 2018. Thank you. Now you are a responsible person according to the Order 503 of 21st of June 2017 for the build-up of the stocks. How it happens so that the Ministry of Energy and Coal Industry is only the body which will help the State Reserve Agency. What are the questions which the ministry is concerned about? What in the ministry is believed the most complicated task in creating such stocks? We would like to ask Ms. Tchaikovska from the Department of Oil and Gas of the Ministry of Energy and Coal Industry. Good afternoon, dear participants of the roundtable discussion. As it has already been said, the order of the Cabinet of 21st June 2017, number 503, have approved the action plan for 2017-2019, and according to the plan, formation of the strategic reserves and adoption of the law on minimum oil stocks is placed on the ministry and the State Reserve Agency, but the Anti-Monopoly Committee of Ukraine should create relevant conditions for build-up of the stocks, and Ministry of Energy and Coal Industry should provide assistance in forming the reserves of crude oil and petroleum products. So all the basics of cooperation between the state agencies have been established, but forming the strategic stock of crude oil and petroleum products, first of all, we should accent on transparent tariff setting on fuel, because when the fuel was bought for the army, Prozora system demonstrated some faults. We should prevent violations. We should prevent any abuse in future. We should consider the opportunity to buy and sell at the stock exchanges. Thank you. So, Mr. Vadym told me about that Ukraine has many storage tanks for storage of crude oil and petroleum products. The capacity is rather big, but not enough for the whole to build up the whole reserve. Yesterday, the representatives of Ukretan Nafta wanted to come to tell us about the storage tank capacities available and about their proposals, how to build up the needed oil reserves by 2023. However, For some reason, I do not see them. Why are you there? And we are thinking how shall we discuss without Ukrtransnafta. Ukrtransnafta is a national operator. Ukrtransnafta is a national operator of oil transportation networks, has a unique potential integrated into the national system. This potential is comprised of the storage tanks and transportation facilities. It is integrated into refinery system. This potential is characterized by high technological status of these facilities, and specific is 50 years of successful experience and unique staff potential, positive funding indicators, financial indicators of the activities, and experience of cooperation with our counterparts from Europe, whose best practices are very important element of preparation to this cooperation. For 3 or 4 years, Ukrtransnafta has been taking active part in discussions on creation of state reserves of crude oil and petroleum products, and one of the main competitive advantages and priorities of Ukrtransnafta is that inside the national program, Ukrtransnafta has been conducting transparent activities, and it is controlled by and managed by the state. These are the obligations of the state of Ukraine to create oil reserves. They are international obligations. And this has an additional load on the economy of the country, on the society, for which the state will be responsible and accountable to the public. Transparent system of storage in the oil segment under the efficient state control is an important priority, especially considering the petroleum products segment and refinery segment are at the stage of creation, and the main reforms are ahead. And in this situation, in this context, to ensure transparency and predictability is possible on the part of Ukrtransnafta, because Ukrtransnafta believes transparency and predictability to be the main features. There is significant potential of storage tanks and infrastructure facilities for the first stage to ensure storage in the short run of relevant oil stocks. In close cooperation with the team of Eurocommission project, have been working on technological, commercial, and other aspects of the storage tank park, storage tank fleet, so that it is developed and get required capacity. Additional storage contracts will be needed, elements of project funding, and the fundraising and on the domestic and international money markets, and balanced tariffs for storage according to the state priorities and obligations. Once again, I would like to accent on that Ukrtransnafta has a clear program how to engage relevant storage tank capacity and how to develop the tank capacity for the period envisaged by the end of 2022. Thank you. You didn't tell us what is the volume, what is the capacity which Ukrtransnafta can keep in its storage tanks. Is it 2.1 million tons which Mr. Mosiychuk needs? In close cooperation with Mr. Mosiychuk and the state agency, reserve agency, we will gain the balanced dynamics of build-up of storage tank capacity. According to our engineers, Ukrtransnafta may provide 120 tons, 1,000 tons. And to build up to the levels which will be set by the international and national experts. According to the specific volume which is needed, 120,000 tons sounds low compared to 2.1 million tons figure. As the total volume of crude oil and petroleum products, depending on crude oil component in this minimum reserves, a specific share could differ. Potential and input data and availability of tank fleet which could be modernized and refurbished to accept more crude oil. This question is rather transparently addressed. We would like to get to know what is proposed by oil experts at the Secretariat of the European Energy Community. What is the proportion which is proposed? What are preliminary opinions, preliminary conclusion of this? We are giving the floor to Angel Minev, team leader of the project assistance to Ukraine in the process of implementation of energy sector reform. I am a team leader of the project of assistance to Ukraine in the process of implementation of energy sector reform, which is funded by the European Commission. We started our activities last year in June. The work plan of the project envisages the task of technical assistance on harmonization of Ukrainian legislation with the Directive 119. Directive 190 is mandatory. Its transposition is mandatory due to several documents. This is an association agreement, obligations to the energy community, and obligations on the sectoral support program. The most important is that build up of oil reserves is very important for Ukraine to support the balance of consumption of oil and petroleum products. We start started our work in May. We prepared the TOR. We have 4 experts already working in this direction, 1 European expert and 3 national Ukrainian experts. One of them is a lawyer, the other one works on technological issues, the third one addresses economic and financial issues. In June, we created the work group with participation of the representative of the State Reserve Agency, the Ministry of Energy and Coal Industry, and market operators of the oil and petroleum product market. And the first meeting was held of the work group in June. The work plan was approved. The plan includes issuing of the documents which should be submitted to the cabinet for approval concerning creation of minimum reserves of oil and petroleum products. We hope, according to our plan, by the end of November, these documents should be prepared after they are approved by the cabinet. The project experts are ready to propose the law on minimum oil and petroleum product stocks and relevant secondary legislation. So far, the project experts have been developing the report on the results. They will be presented to the work group on November 8. In this report, we address 2 options of creating stockholding model in Ukraine. Of course, Directive 119 provides the opportunity to every country to choose its own national model. In this sense, Europe has 28 different models. So, we, together with the expert in the work group, focused attention on the model which today is used in Slovakia, and we consider this model, but in 2 versions. One is 100% participation of the state, in the second option 70% of the state participation. The rest will be given to the marketplace, and the model where tickets could be used. This is the right to buy of crude oil and petroleum products. So, we have been working, and we hope to complete our tasks according to our plan. Thank you. Thank you. Now, I'm very interested. What problems can Ukraine face while developing relevant regulations, while selecting the model of stockholding? In this, I think the experience of our European colleagues is very valuable, as they have already created oil stocks and petroleum product stocks. So I'm giving the floor to Mr. Adrian, Jasimi, oil expert.
For having me here, and in particular the management of DiXi Group. I was invited to present within 15 minutes what is going on in the EU about oil stock and in energy community and also in Ukraine. But being very short slot, I thought it's better to prepare a short presentation to present the key points for this topic. And then I would like to start with, I have in front of me the same slides because it's not easy for me to view the screen. And I have presented stockholding models in the EU level, and you can see most of that are public and stock and where it is included governmental stock, central or agency stock, and also it's industry related that mainly is in this part here in the last part. But if you can see the combination of government and agency and the economic operator is the dominant part of this graph. And then but I want to mention here that assuring of oil security is a matter of national security and social responsibility. Therefore, it's an obligation of the government to fulfill this request because it's a public. In the energy community, first I wanted to present oil data for 2016. It's very hard to get this data in any other, let's say, organization, but due to our very good relation that we have with the representatives of the ministry, we get the latest data and we provide this in the oil forum that we have also usually in October or in November. This year will be in November. And as you can see from this slide, we have only 3 countries that are oil-producing countries, that is Albania, Serbia, and Ukraine. Albania is the only contracting party that export more than 90%, and on the other of it's crude oil, and on the other hand, they import a lot of petroleum products. So we can see now Ukraine that produce around 2.3 million, something like that, 2.2, 2.3, and they produce in the country less than 1 million or 1.1 million tons and import a lot, around 7.5 million tons, and their consumption is around 10,000 million. This is the 10,000 million. This is the reason that I'm mentioning that based on this data, we are going to move forward to what is the current stockholding obligation in Ukraine. So I prepared a very short presentation what is going on in all contracting party, but in brief I can say that only 2 contracting party, only Serbia and Macedonia are building stock currently. The rest are struggling with the preparation of primary and secondary legislation. Most of them have their drafts ready, and it's done with the close cooperation and assistance of the Secretariat. And but it's the same problem everywhere. 2 are the main problems. The first one is the deadline. It's end of 2022, and when you talk to the ministers of this contracting party, they think, oh, it's too far for that, and they don't know that they are too late about this. And on the other hand is the fee that should be introduced, and whenever they hear about one new fee that they consider as a new tax on oil product, they always are very hesitant. Only Bosnia and Herzegovina has no legislation in place. They have their specific conditions, having 2 entities. Both entities want to maintain stock by themselves, but based on the directive, this is not allowed, should be only on the state level. And this is the problem that we have with them, despite that on state level they have their stockholding policy that is not in compliance with directive, but still they build stock based on their internal policy as an entity. Let's go now to Ukraine. This is something that I would present very briefly based on what we have discussed with the working group 2 years ago, and I have updated a little bit this presentation based on current conditions. And we have taken into consideration when we prepared the model for Ukrainian obligation, having 30% crude oil and also 70% petroleum product. But for this 70% petroleum product, we have taken into consideration the current consumption trend in Ukraine, that is around 33% is gasoline and 67% is diesel and gas oil. Primary in the form of it's one precondition also to be physical commodity to be in the country, and if they do not have success, then to see the possibility for getting tickets. And on the right side of the screen, I have prepared what is a ton of crude oil equivalent for Ukraine, and for each product, for crude oil, we are talking here about 580,000 tons, or converted in crude oil equivalent around 500,000. And for gasoline is 460,000, and for gasoline, diesel gasoline is around 1 million, or exactly 930,000. But in crude oil equivalent is around one. So if we fix, we have in our mind only this figure that we are talking here for an obligation of about 2 million tons of crude oil equivalent. Is very easy to follow the logic of the other steps. In addition to that, we have presented what is the required nominal capacity for each product that will be maintained, and we end up with around 2.6 million cubic meter that should be in place in order to maintain these products. So we have preserved plant build-up starting from 2017, but this is not the case now, and I have prepared another slide on the right side, supposing that maybe they will start in 2018. This is also very optimistic, but still I wanted to compare the consequences from this delay, and you can see that in our projection, we have seen from 2017 to start with 30 days, and then with every year 12 days additional. But in the new scenario that I have prepared during these days, we have to jump from 30 to 45, 60. That means every year we have to add 15 days net import of petroleum products or crude oil equivalent. So this is in the first year in 2018. You see the percentage of crude oil, it's a little bit less than in the other years, because we have envisaged that part of this crude oil will be transferred from Ukrtrasnafta to this model that is suggested to the agency, and then later they will start to build up their stock until they will reach the final figure of 580,000 tons, and this is all the figures that are presented here, and you can see the diesel from that is foreseen for around 430 in 2019. Now in 2019 will be the situation that will not be the same scenario for this, because we have shifted from 12 days every year to 15 days now due to these delays. Funds needed. We have done many assumptions about that, and also I have also prepared two different scenarios. The initial one that was to start from 2017, and this one, the second one, is 2018. But in overall, we are talking here for an investment around $1 billion US. And for every year, based on our initial calculation, we have foreseen about 4 billion Ukrainian hryvnia to be invested every year. But now, based on this delay and postponement of the transposition of primary and secondary legislation, now the situation, if we stick to this project, that means that the final deadline will be 2022. Then Ukraine must spend every year 5 billion Ukrainian hryvnia in order to fulfill this obligation and to build up this stock within 5 years, starting from 1st January 2018 until end of 2022. Here there are many assumptions and figures, but it's not purpose of this round table to go in details of these elements. What I see on behalf of the Secretariat as the main milestone to be completed, and I'm very happy that more or less I got the same impression and I hear the same opinion from representative from State Reserve Agency, from the Ministry of Energy, and from representative of company that is doing this current study and this transposition of primary and secondary legislation in Ukraine. And we think that emergency oil stock model and governmental decision should be approved by December 2017 as the latest. Approval by the government, we think first quarter 2018, and then approval by Parliament and President within the second quarter of next year, and in parallel, having in mind that the primary legislation is approved by the government, the company, or the country to prepare the secondary legislation, and then approval of secondary legislation required under the law that is supposed to be approved by second quarter of 2018. So after this very brief picture about what is going on in Ukraine and in the contracting party, I want to mention here that there is a substantial amount of work to be done by a majority. As I mentioned, most of the contracting party are in the transposition phase. They have all these drafts in full compliance with directive, but they are hesitant to approve and to move forward. It's the same situation now is in Ukraine until last year, or let's say better this year, when the new study, new technical assistance is provided, and I feel very comfortable that Ukraine is going to move very fast, at least from a transposition point of view. And that to overcome this situation, as I mentioned, we had only one deadline, that was end of 2022. Now we suggested some intermediate deadline, and then deadlines, and these deadlines were adopted in last year by Minister Council, and all contracting parties were invited to follow these guidelines and stepwise approach to bring into law the force, regulations, and administrative position necessary to comply with directive by the end of this year. Unfortunately, none of the contracting party, apart from two, have sent some information about that. One of them is Moldova, that has prepared a draft law on emergency oil stock with the technical assistance. And in addition to this, based on the requirements of the Annexes 1 and 4, and 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the directive, all contracting parties were invited to start to prepare JODI oil questionnaire and to send to us starting from 1st January 2018, and also to communicate to the Secretariat by end of March 2018 all proposals that are related to monthly oil statistics, because it's a different, there is a, let's say, a big difference between how is JODI calculated and monthly oil statistics that is based on an approach of the IEA and the European Commission. So based on that, I think that I try to present very briefly what is going on in the energy community and Ukraine, and what are the, let's say, the next steps that are adopted by the ministers, and that means that all contracting parties should fulfill this obligation. But for this intermediate deadline, these are kind of invitation, are not legally binding obligation. We have only one legally binding obligation, that is the final deadline of full implementation of the oil stock, that is end of or 1st January of 2023. So this is what more or less what I wanted to present for this very short slot of this round table.
Дякую.
Thank you. what is the model which is believed the best tailoring for Ukraine by those who will be performing this model? They are market players, so I am giving the floor to Vice President of Galnaftogaz concern, Mr. Kuchabskyi. I'd like primarily to say what is our attitude to this draft law. Whatever the model, it will be very costly, so anyway some tax will be introduced as a percentage of funding for creation such reserves. As a business entity, we are against taxes, of course, but there is no other way out. Ukraine should create the reserves, we should create them. This would help us to build energy security of the country. I'd like to say that I am very glad that this process is now rather transparent and public, and this process of stockholding models creation involves companies, Oil and Gas Association, Profile Association, which members understand how to do this in practice. I'm very optimistic to believe that we will give birth to the working model. What are the main fears and risks in this process? We will try to prevent them and to mitigate them. This is an additional tax, first of all, because it would be additional load and burden. The model should be so that upon implementation, the competition on the market is not distorted. It should be either excise duty or just obligation to create reserve for one imposed on one companies, and the other companies will not be obliged, because we had such similar situation with retail duty. In 2015, this duty was introduced at local level, and as a result 50% of market players paid this tax and 50% of companies did not pay it, although the law should apply to all players equally, and nobody was punished for non-payments. The competition on the market was significantly distorted because non-payers gained very big advantage over other market players. The next, I believe it is very important that the operator who will manage this stock, it should be independent, not controlled by the state. All of us understand that in any case, earlier or later, the politicians and the state will try to use this reserve to control pricing. When, for example, world oil prices would grow, and this directive of European Union is not for funding, is not for leveling up the prices, but for creation of the stock in the country. When, for example, at some refinery some accident happened, or in ports or railway stations some accidents may happen, resulting in disruption of supply. And the last, we should not forget about LPG. We experienced very big crisis on the LPG market. We understand that this market works with very small stocks, because specifics of this product will be very expensive to build LPG storages, but we should not forget that gasoline is the product with which LPG could be replaced always. So those volumes of LPG which became popular in Ukraine recently, we should form stocks of gasoline for replacement of LPG for the case of some disruption of supply. I don't know what model will finally be selected by, but anyway, it would be through additional excise duty. Gas also should be subject to excise duty then. And the third issue, we believe that the stocks should be placed in the storage tanks maximum close to the sales points. For example, the storage tank in Zakarpatska region, which is 3 kilometers far from refineries, would be transported back to the refinery. This would then involve high costs of logistics. So, Mr. Yuriy, you think that besides oil and petroleum products, we also should create LPG stocks? No, this is a controversial issue. We should create some very small stock, but in any case, we should consider that we can use petroleum, we could use gasoline to replace LPG. So the stock of petroleum should be built up to replace LPG volumes in case of LPG supply disruption. Thank you. Truly speaking, I saved time for us to discuss the questions among the audience and our speakers, so we have the opportunity to debate and to ask and answer questions. But please, 3 minutes to speakers and 1 minute to askers. Introduce yourself, please. Victor Liren, Institute of Economy of the Academy of Science of Ukraine. I have a question to our officials, Mr. Oleksandr and Mr. Vadym. We know that last month the work of Pivdenny terminal resumed. Its capacity is 80,000 tons. In 2005, there were intentions to build 4 more terminals for 115,000 tons, and it would be 600,000 tons, about which deficit Mr. Vadym noted today. Whether this project would be resuscitated, let's say so. Are there any donors, potential donors to this project? In the scope of strategic plan of Ukrtransnafta development, there are developments to develop the capacities of terminals, including in the context of participation of Ukrtransnafta in creation and maintenance of operation of strategic reserves, development on the basis of Pivdenny terminal of additional storage tanks. According to our engineers' estimates and calculations, they are being refined with the project team experts, and I would like to support the vision of our colleagues that the location, geographic location of strategic stocks should be balanced, should be integrated maximum to the relevant infrastructure, including considering the opportunities of Ukrtransnafta at Pivdenny terminal. There is a strategic plan to build additional storage tanks at Pivdenny. I'd like to add, I had a conversation with Ukrtransnafta management. As far as I know, Ukrtransnafta is interested in building and modernization of capacities, and they are very interested in having long-term contracts on storage of these reserves. We will support this because State Reserve Agency is interested not only in developing our own capacities, which are about 1 million tons of simultaneous storage. This project will give the opportunity to build capacities of marketplace. This would give impetus to economic growth, investment into building. So, of course, we cooperate with Ukrtransnafta, and we will be also cooperating with market players ready to build new capacities. Last question, please. 2 questions. Sergey Fedorenko. Ukrvidobivання. I support Mr. Kuchabskyi as a producers as to tax burden. LPG is a substitute which could be substituted by petroleum, petroleum products such as gasoline. Have you already developed a policy how replenishment of stocks will take place, and about interventions, when to buy, when to sell, in what seasons? If it is a state-owned enterprise, it would face the same problems as Ministry of Defense and Ukrainian National Railways to set prices. So this is the question. Ukrzaliznytsia railway operator has failed to do anything, and the Ministry of Defense also faces problems of pricing. And we see this when our cars remain at railway stations? I would like to answer. On November 8th, there will be a meeting of work group. If Укргазвидобування, your company has proposals, your vision and your proposals, how it should look like, we will consider and incorporate your proposals, because domestic manufacturers' attitudes and opinions are of high interest for us. Yes, different models have been considered, but they will be included into the regulations after the law is adopted. Those models which exist in Europe, I think all of them will be used in Ukraine when the oil is bought and then sell via e-auctions. And also we will buy with guarantees and in fact create replenishment, conduct replenishment, or market operator, a company, for example, Nafto Reserve company, which is to be created, or other company will take obligations on replenishment of stocks, either free of charge or on paid basis.
Everyone to know that in case that we are talking now for LPG and to be part of this mandatory oil stock, then in Ukraine they have to take into consideration to establish specific stock, because directive doesn't allow to have LPG in calculation unless you have a specific stock, part of the emergency oil stock obligation. So this should be foreseen in the legislation in case that it's an internal policy that you want to be LPG part of, and this is good. Related to the other question, I think that the best model for Ukraine, it's my personal view, is to have a strong cooperation between this agency that will be established, that will be the owner of the stock, of the oil stock, and the industry that will maintain these products. And in this case, all these processes that like refreshment and all this technical stuff will be maintained and will be carried out in very professional way from the industry. This is the best way how we can avoid all this extra cost, and in our model we have foreseen what is the exact fee that agency should pay to industry in case that they will maintain this product for 1 ton crude oil, and also for 1 ton per month for diesel and gas oil and all the other stuff. So this is the way I would think that will be handled all this process.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we should end. We are short of time, and now you can ask. I would like to announce our next event. After the work group will define the model, and the draft law is ready on minimum oil reserves. At the beginning of next year, we will hold the next roundtable discussion. The National Institute of Strategic Research has invited us. We should go to the top level, I mean the leaders of the states. We should invite them. Unfortunately, we are short of time. This is the organizers who decide on the time frame. Thank you.